Welcome to Remembering John Lewis with Ambassador Andrew Young. I'm Charles Shapiro, President of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. Today's program is brought to you by the Coca-Cola Company. We've got a large audience, board members, former ambassadors, people from World Affairs Councils across the country, but there are two people I'd like to single out: Dr. Mark Becker, President of Georgia State University, and Carol Moldauer, who used to work in Congressman Andrew Young's office back in the 70s. If you've got questions, and I hope you will.
She was a little girl.
She's not aged a bit. If you have questions, please send them to me using the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And I feel crazy introducing you, Ambassador Young, because everybody knows who you are, but here's the short version. Andrew Young served as Executive Director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a close confidant to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Ambassador Young served 2 terms in Congress representing the 5th District of Georgia, what was later to be John Lewis's seat. He was the Ambassador of the United Nations in the Carter administration, the 55th Mayor of Atlanta, and the Chair of the Atlanta Organizing Committee for the 1996 Summer Olympics. And for the purposes of this discussion today, a good friend of John Lewis. Ambassador Young, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure.
How did you first meet John Lewis?
I met John Lewis first on television. I was in New York working for the National Council of Churches in the Department of Youth Work, and we had just bought a house in Queens, and I had a good job, best job I'd ever had so far. A television show on CBS, and I thought I was settling into a life of success. And John Lewis came on, the National Sit-In Story, and my wife then, my first wife, Jean, at the first intermission said, "It's time for us to go home." I said, "Well, we are home. We just bought this house." She said, "No, my home can never be New York. We've got to go back south." And I said, "Well, what do you want me to do?" She said, "Quit this job, sell this house, and let's go back." I said, "Back where?" She said, "I don't know, but we'll figure it out after you sell the house and quit your job." And I ended up, long story short, I ended up working with the United Church of Christ on an adult literacy program to teach people to read and write, to register to vote. And the office they found for me was right across the hall from Dr. King. And that's what put me in the civil rights movement. But I wanted to be around and I wanted to be a part of it, but I really didn't want to. Well, I was, by that time, I had been with the National Council of Churches for 3 years, and I traveled Europe to Latin America, and I wanted to be around the movement, close to the movement, but I didn't want to get too involved because I felt that all of the people who stayed in the South all along had, they were territorial rights, and I was an outsider coming in. But I came in with a separate budget that the Field Foundation wanted to give to SCLC, but they didn't have tax exempt status. So they gave it to the United Church of Christ, and they sent me down to administer it, along with Septima Clark of South Carolina and Dorothy Cotton of Virginia. And it put us in the movement, but not under all the Baptist preachers. And I started, Dr. King's secretary asked me if I would, my wife was well, had our baby, our third baby, and we didn't have a place to live in Atlanta. So we went to her home in Marion, Alabama. I got a room at the YMCA, and Dora McDonald said, idle mind is a devil's workshop. If you hang around Atlanta, you're going to get in trouble. Why don't you help Dr. King answer some of his mail? And I said, I'd be glad to. So she gave me a great big egg crate stacked with letters that he'd been receiving for the last 3 or 4 years. And I started out answering those letters. I then went over to Nashville on Fisk campus, and there was John Lewis in the midst of the fraternity sorority pledge week, and everybody on the campus is jumping up and down, doing what fraternities and sororities do. And here was John with about 6 or 7 people going in a completely opposite direction. And I said, who is that and where are they going? So that's John Lewis. He's still going around every time he has a day off and tests the restaurants that agreed to desegregate. He's testing them to make sure that they lived up to their agreement. I said, golly, that's really important. And John was set apart in my mind from the very beginning. He was always quiet. He was always serious and determined. And he kept his eye on the prize, even when he was, I think he couldn't have been more than 20 then.
He was still an undergrad.
Yeah, he was still an undergrad.
Wow.
But there was something serious about that whole group. And those who saw the service yesterday saw Jim Lawson, who had just come back from India, where he was serving as a Methodist missionary, and he had studied Gandhi. C.T. Vivian, who just passed the same day as John, had moved to Nashville from Illinois, where he was leading sit-ins in 1947. And the two of them got together and started a 6 o'clock in the morning nonviolent workshop. And most of the people who ended up around John Lewis, James Bevel, Marion Barry, who later became the mayor of Washington, Diane Nash, Bernard Lafayette, who's still with us and over in Tuskegee. And there were about 20 students that get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and they read Gandhi and they discussed Gandhi and nonviolence for almost a semester before they started demonstrating. So they were the best trained nonviolent student group in the country, I think.
Can you just talk real quickly about, I mean, I think young people don't know what nonviolent resistance actually means.
Well, this was not long. Well, it was a pretty good ways. Gandhi took India to independence in 1947. And many of the college presidents were invited to India's independence. And they came back talking about Gandhi and how he was able to free India from the colonial domination of the British without killing anybody. And it was something that he called satyagraha, or truth force, or soul force. And it was an introduction to the presence of spiritual power in the face of political, economic, and military power. And Jim Lawson and C.T. Vivian had experience with that. And they spent almost a semester meeting regularly with the students until that spring of 1960, when they launched the Nashville sit-ins.
And there's always been a connection. I mean, there was a connection between the civil rights movement and religion and Gandhi as well, correct?
Well, the interesting thing is that it was kind of hard for us as Southern Black Christians to appreciate Jesus as he was described by Southern white Christians. I mean, their Jesus at that time was a Jesus that believed in segregation. And they interpreted various passages of the New Testament in a way that at least tolerated slavery. Gandhi introduced us to a different Jesus. And he read, Southern Christianity was mostly from Paul and the letters of Paul in the New Testament. The life of Jesus and the idea of turning the other cheek, the idea of forgiving those that persecute you, bless those that persecute you, the idea that that you can live together as brothers without violence. And Dr. King had taken that to heart in 1955. So I had read Dr. King's books, and I had met Bayard Rustin, who was doing the same sort of teaching that Jim Lawson was teaching through the American Friends Service Committee. And my wife had gone to a Church of the Brethren school in Indiana, Manchester College, where she had had a course in New Testament nonviolence. Coretta King was from the same high school that she went to. She had gone to Antioch College in Ohio, and that was another school where peace studies and the Women's Strike for Peace was formed. So I kind of married into nonviolence, as did Martin Luther King, because we did not study nonviolence too much in theological seminary. But my seminary was my Old Testament and New Testament courses. I happen to have Quaker professors who were very quick to point out the nonviolent teachings of the Bible. So I was prepared, but I'd never seen it in action until I saw it in Nashville.
On Bloody Sunday, you were in Selma. You were one of the marchers on the bridge. Can you just talk about that for a minute?
Wasn't. Well, Selma, the march occurred on the wrong day. It was a leap year that year, and the march was supposed to be the second Sunday in March, and the day that Bloody Sunday turned out to be the first Sunday. And so Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy and Reverend Shuttlesworth and all of the preachers who had churches were in their churches in Atlanta or Shuttlesworth in Cincinnati, and there was nobody, none of the leaders were present, and 300 people showed up. And so John was there, and I was there, Jose was there, and Bevel was there. And we called Dr. King and said, look, these people came to march, and they want to march without you. And I said, they probably won't go far. I could see that the state troopers and Jim Clark had blocked Highway 80 on the other side of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And I said, they'll probably be stopped there and they'll either turn around or get arrested or something. And Martin said, well, don't you get arrested. You let John Lewis was there representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, even though they voted not to take part in the march. And John said, well, I am taking part in the march. I'm not going to let a march go on because of this movement politics. King has got a march, I'm going to be in it. And so he was set. And so James Bevel, Hosea Williams, and I decided that only one of us should go. And so we flipped a coin. Jose became the odd man. And so he got to lead the march with John Lewis. And we stayed back to avoid getting arrested. And we're in the back of the line when the tear gas started and the beating started. And so we were helping people to get out of the way, but we were not in the line of fire.
And John Lewis was 25 years old at the time.
Yeah.
That's amazing that the movement was led. I mean, you were in your 30s.
Well,
such young people led the movement.
Yeah, I was 33. Hosea was a little older because Hosea had been to the military. He'd been in World War II in Germany and had almost gotten killed there. In fact, everybody else in his foxhole was killed, and he was spared. And he was in the hospital for 11 months in England and came back to Georgia, and in a uniform with a Purple Heart and on crutches, he bought a cup to get water from a fountain that said white only. And he figured he wasn't drinking out of the fountain, he was just getting some. And he said he'd seen people get, water for their dogs from those fountains. And so he bought a cup and was drinking water, and a group of young white hoodlums kind of roughed up this veteran who was on crutches. And he decided that God had saved him to give his life in his own country, not in Germany or France. And so he was anxious to be a part of the march also. I used to say Hosea was always trying to get himself killed because he figured should have died in Europe. And so he was kind of reckless in everything he did here. And that was the background of it.
How did you and John Lewis and Dr. King and the others, how did you not get cynical and angry and discouraged?
Well, I was raised to understand that you don't ever let sick people make you angry. And my father told me that white supremacy is a sickness. Actually, the Nazi party was on the corner of my house. 50 yards from where I was born was the headquarters, was the Deutsche House. And I was walking past there even before I was in kindergarten and hearing them hailing Hitler and singing Deutschland über alles. And walking by there one day, my father said, now, these people are white supremacists, but you know that God made of one blood all the nations of the earth. And my father was a dentist, and many of his suppliers were Jewish. So there were discussions of Nazism and Hitler and what was going on in Europe at my house all the time. And so he said, you know that God made of one blood all the nations of the world. But they don't want to admit that. But that's a sickness. And you don't let sick people get you upset. You have to help them. And you're too young to help them now. But so you just stay out of their way. But don't ever let them get you angry or frustrated. That's their problem, not yours. Your problem is to use your head. Don't. And he used to say, don't get mad, get smart. When you get angry, the blood rushes from your head to your fist or your feet, and you do something because he was 5'4", and he said, you're never going to be more than 5'7" or 8", so you're not going to be able to beat up anybody much. He said, but if you stay calm, you can think with anybody and use your mind, and don't ever let anybody make you angry. And he lived that way. That was
all of y'all seem to live that way. I mean, that
child rearing in the South. That was sort of standard way you brought up a child in the South in those days. That was in the I can remember that as 1936, because he also took me to see the movies of the Berlin Olympics. And when Jesse Owens won the 100-meter dash, instead of giving him his medal as he was supposed to, Hitler got mad and walked out. And my dad pointed out, but see, he said, Jesse didn't let that bother him at all. That was Hitler's problem. Jesse just went on, kept his cool, and won 3 more gold medals. So that's the way you deal with white supremacy. You ignore it, go on about your business, and do the best that you can.
Yesterday in the papers, when we opened our papers, we found that long and beautiful piece written by John Lewis to be embargoed until the day of his funeral. Is that like John Lewis to leave instructions?
Well, that's not the John Lewis I knew. And the John Lewis I knew was humble to a fault. But I can see that as a John Lewis that, John Lewis and I were close in action, and we agreed tactically on what was going on in the South. He was, later the next year, he was overturned as the president of SNCC by Stokely Carmichael, who wanted to shout Black Power. And John felt that, John felt like Martin Luther King, that power is like money in the bank. The less you use it, the more you have. And to go around shout, and he said, there is such a thing as Catholic power, but the Catholics deny it. Anytime you want to upset your Jewish friends, talk about Jewish power. People who have power don't want to advertise it. And here we are, probably with the least amount of power of any group. And it just is not reasonable for us to go around shouting Black Power. It doesn't do anything for us. And actually, when it was accompanied by, in the Black Panther movement, by people with guns shouting that, it basically got them killed. And they were not violent people. They basically were community servants. They served breakfast. They had freedom schools and taught children. And they were exemplary young men and women. But the shout of Black Power antagonized people. And I guess I've always felt that, and I've never understood why, but for some reason, I associated racism and prejudice with fear. And so you don't want to provoke people who are already scary or afraid of you. And I don't understand why. Well, fear and guilt. I think that this is an untruth that people had to convince themselves of in order to tolerate themselves in the midst of slavery. I mean, the slaves who came here from Africa were not savages. They had agricultural skills, they had construction skills. There were universities in Africa all the way back to the 10th century. There's no way these people could have been enslaved without brute force. And so you had Southern or Europeans who call themselves Christians. I mean, that's the contradiction that Thomas Jefferson was a religious man. John Adams was a devout man. Alexander Hamilton was educated by Presbyterian preachers who brought him from the islands to New York to Columbia University, which was then King's College. And he was a brilliant young man, but he had seen slavery in the Caribbean, and they had to know that this slavery was wrong, morally wrong. But they could not have created this union and taken on the United States of America and taken on the slavery issue at the same time. And so it was a contradiction they lived with, and that has been part of our body politic from the very beginning. But the first person to die in the independence of this nation was Crispus Attucks, a freed black man in Boston. So that it was Frederick Douglass, who was a friend of Lincoln's, who had never been to school in his life, but who was one of the most brilliant, who taught himself to read, was one of the most brilliant orators and writers of his time. And there's no way even Lincoln could have thought of him as being inferior.
Ambassador Young, we're going to move to some questions from the audience, and I'm getting multiple people asking the same thing. And one of the key questions that folks are asking is, where are the young John Lewis's and Andrew Youngs today?
Well, I think
where's the next generation?
Saw them, I think you saw them by the thousands. You saw them 1,000-fold in the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, I don't know the extent to which they have studied nonviolence seriously, as John did and as I did. And the Martin Luther King has not emerged yet. But that's one of the strengths of that movement. And it was the same thing with the movement against the war in Vietnam. One of the things that we see in these movements is that once the American people are confronted with the evil, as they were on Bloody Sunday, as they saw peaceful men and women walking across a bridge and being beaten up and tear gassed for nothing, they said, no, I don't want to be a part of that. That's not the America I love. But they said that in Black Lives Matter because they watched George Floyd die. And nobody wanted, for 8.5 minutes, nobody wanted us with that kind of sickness. Now, the same thing was true in the war in Vietnam. I think the thing that stopped the war was a picture of a nude little girl whose clothes had been burned off by napalm, walking down a road crying on the cover of Life magazine. And it was almost that picture that said, no, this war's not right. And it was the same with John Lewis and Hosea Williams in the Bloody Sunday March. I think, and I'm not sure where I got this from, but somebody told me that that there were 48 million viewers of Judgment at Nuremberg, looking at television that Sunday afternoon, and they broke from Judgment at Nuremberg, which was about Hitler's persecution of Jews and his takeover of Germany, to Selma. And overwhelmingly, people said, no, that's not right. That's not the America I love. And it motivated Lyndon Johnson to then pass the Voting Rights Act.
That Voting Rights Act led to all across, or not immediately, but across the country, the election of African-American mayors and congressmen and senators. The impact of the Voting Rights Act had changed America. I mean, it was a point of inflection. Do you think 10, 20 years from now, we'll look back at Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and see that as leading to the same sort of permanent, lasting change in America as y'all achieved in the 60s?
I hope it doesn't take that long, and I don't think it will, because communications is such now that they were able. It took us 3 months to organize Birmingham to get 55 people to go to jail with Martin Luther King. They got 55,000 people in a matter of minutes in the wake of George Floyd's death. And it was not just in Minneapolis. People were saying Black Lives Matter in Africa, in New Zealand, all over Europe, Asia. This because of the times in which we live, where not only do ideas go around the world in a matter of seconds, but you can transfer money. You can make sales, you can make deals. At a time when technology and viruses can go global, it's absolutely the wrong time for the United States of America that it can pull out of the world and be isolation. It just does not work. I mean, it is impossible. And I think if you look at the way President Obama dealt with Ebola and compare it with the way we've dealt with the corona, they got on top of it very quickly in Africa, and it never got to the United States. But they broke off part of the Center for Disease Control, and they immediately transferred it to set up shop in Africa to treat this disease in Africa. And that's what the World Health Organization gives you an opportunity to do. And you can protect America better abroad than you can if you let the diseases come here, as we've done this time.
I've got some questions for a whole bunch of them. We're not going to get to all of them. I apologize. Veronica Toscano de Legere asks, can you give us one word to describe John Lewis?
You know, humble. I mean, John Lewis exemplified the power of humility. And I don't think of humility as powerful, but you think of humility as weak and shy. But John Lewis was genuinely humble, but he was always on the case in a way that was not threatening. And he brought out the best in us by not by a big ego, but by his humble, loving spirit. And that was especially effective in Congress, because Lewis would not only walk up to people who disagreed with him violently and say, "How are you doing today, my brother? How is my sister today?" And he would go out and campaign for them, without asking anything in return. But when he got a bill through, he had already obligated people, to support him because he had supported them. Here in Atlanta, I think that we were able, working together. That was before he was in Congress and before I was mayor. We both went to campaign for a gentleman in New Jersey on separate weekends, a fellow by the name of Jim Howard. And when I got to be mayor and he was on the city council, Jim Howard was in charge of the highway money. And our highways were in real bad trouble. We didn't have, that was before we even widened the downtown connector. I went to see the state highway director, whose name I can't remember right now. But he said some SOB in Washington has frozen up the highway money. And I said, "Well, who is he?" He said, "Some guy from New Jersey." And I said, "Not Jim Howard." And so we called him and invited him to come down. He couldn't refuse our invitation. And when we showed him what our highway situation was, we got a helicopter from Michael Lomax in the county and took him around to see what traffic was like in Atlanta. And he cut loose $900 million for the state highway system. And that was that. That was just before, that was right after I got to be mayor. Now, John didn't like highways. John didn't like roads, but he didn't like the Presidential Parkway because he had promised not to build any more roads. But that didn't include widening 75, 85, and the perimeter and I-20. But once we got going, we had to build the Presidential Parkway, or Freedom Parkway as we now call it. And I'm very proud that we were able to put John Lewis' name on it. It's John Lewis Freedom Parkway. And he helped get the money for it.
How else should we honor?
Again.
How else should we honor John Lewis? I mean, there's all kinds of people with all kinds of great ideas. What should we do to beyond John Lewis Freedom Parkway?
Well, there are two things. There are two things that I've been working with people on. One at Georgia State, and I think Dr. Becker might be on, and I was scheduled to meet with him about it. And I think his people are working on it. But we were thinking that John Lewis deserves a place at Georgia State University, and that one of the many buildings Dr. Becker's been building down there possibly could be dedicated to John Lewis. The other thing is we've already got a 9-foot statue that I understand he saw pictures of, and he liked it, but I think he liked it, and I understand it looks like him. I haven't seen it, but it's already just about finished, everything but the pedestal that it goes on, but it's 9 feet tall. And one thing all of us short fellas have in common is we all wish we were a little taller. And so to have a 9-foot tall statue of John Lewis in the Peace Park that we're hoping to dedicate there on Northside Drive, just south of Joseph E. Boone. And it'll start with Chief Tamachichi, the Native American chief that gave land to General Oglethorpe, the first settlers in Georgia, and did it peacefully, who then later went back to England and was recognized by the king. And Georgia started off with a very peaceful relationship with the Native American population. And it'll start with Chief Tamachichi in this Peace Park. And at the top of the Peace Park, it ends at the door, at the foot of Martin Luther King's family home. And C.T. Vivian's library and books will be housed there. And there's already a statue already made for John Lewis. And we're ready to move ahead with that, and I think the country is too.
I think it's great. I want to thank you, Ambassador Andrew Young. This has been a terrific conversation with you. I promised you only 45 minutes. I've got one last question for you, and that is, what does it say about John Lewis that George W. Bush, an opponent of his, spoke at his funeral?
Well, it says that John didn't have any enemies, and that I gave the prayer at George W. Bush's first meeting of the presidential prayer breakfast in his presidency. And I think we've always tried to be bipartisan or nonpartisan. And George Bush was easy to get along with, both father and son, mainly because of the mother. And she was on the board of Morehouse Medical School and helped to found Morehouse Medical School.
I didn't realize that.
And I actually, when I was in Congress, I got beat by George Bush in a tennis tournament between the congressmen. But he had been a tennis. He played on Yale's tennis team, and the senator from Louisiana had been on LSU's tennis team, and my wife and I ended up playing them in a doubles championship where we held our own, but we got beat. But in those days, Congress was really a very friendly place. And we disagreed, but we were not disagreeable. I got drawing a blank on his name, the congressman from New York who was quarterback for the Bulls, Jack Kemp. And Newt Gingrich. We'd always argued about them. They said they were conservative, not racist. And so we took to them, we said, well, look, this is a good place to show that you can be conservative and not racist. And we need you to help us co-sponsor the boycott against South Africa. When they did, it was interesting. We couldn't get any of the Democratic liberals to sign it. But we got them to sign first, and once they signed it, then the Democrats came on, and we didn't want it to be a black issue because it was Africa. we wanted it to be an issue about democracy and freedom. And their willingness to step forward to that is one of the things that helped us have a peaceful transfer of power in South Africa, in Rhodesia, and in Namibia and Southern Africa. That was back during the Carter administration. But President Carter was very much like John Lewis. He was a powerful, humble, brilliant man that everybody underestimated, and and they liked him, but they didn't see the tremendous vision and brain power, and Jimmy Carter did not have a single American soldier killed in battle during his presidency, nor did any American soldier kill anybody. And I think he's the only president whose term was able to accomplish that. And I think Eisenhower came close, but two men with military backgrounds were the ones who helped us to find our way to peace.
Ambassador Young, I want to thank you so much for giving us so much time this morning. This has been terrific. I want to end quoting President Obama from yesterday, who at the end of his eulogy said, "God bless America. God bless this gentle soul who pulled America closer to its promise." That's John Lewis. I have a request for everybody on this Zoom. John Lewis, in the piece that he wrote that ran in the New York Times and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, said that democracy is not a state, it is an act. And there's an act that we need to undertake, and that is to make our elections work better. And I'm going to encourage everybody to volunteer to be a poll worker. If you have employees, please give your employees paid time off to take the training and become poll workers on November 3rd. Democracy is too important to leave to others. And while you're at it, join the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. I want to thank you, the members of the World Affairs Council. I want to thank the Coca-Cola Company for making this program today possible. I want to thank you, Ambassador Andrew Young. We've got a program next week on Confederate statues, A Reckoning. This is next Thursday. It's with an Agnes Scott historian, Robin Morris, who thinks they should be removed, and with Rodney Cook, founder of the Historic Monuments Foundation. I think all of them should stay in place. Join us for that discussion. It's going to be great fun. And I want to thank the World Affairs Council staff, Fernanda Lukine Ishihara, our Executive Director, Valerin Lopez DeFrank, our Business Manager, and Ladarian Gillette, producer. Thank you again, Ambassador Young. I hope you will join us again. I've got more questions to ask you than we can answer. And you've got an extraordinary memory for who was doing what, when, and on the exact date it took place. So I hope you will join us again. Thank you very much. And thank you all. And I apologize to those of you whose questions we couldn't get to. Thank you again. Have a good morning.